December 16, 1944. The snow falls silent over the Ardennes Forest. American soldiers huddle in frozen foxholes, believing the worst is behind them. They have no idea that in just hours, 250,000 German soldiers will unleash hell itself upon them in Hitler's final, desperate gamble to change the course of World War II. This is the story of the Battle of the Bulge, the largest and bloodiest battle American forces would ever fight, and today marks exactly 80 years since it began. Welcome to Silent Warriors, where we honor the courage and sacrifice of those who fought for freedom. What you're about to hear is not just another war story. This is the tale of teenagers freezing to death in Belgian forests, of medics treating wounds with bare hands in sub-zero temperatures, of tank crews fighting blind through blizzards, and of a battle so savage that even hardened veterans would call it their worst nightmare. By the time this battle ended, over 19,000 Americans would lie dead in the snow, but they would accomplish something Hitler never thought possible. They would break the back of Nazi Germany's last great offensive. Stay with me, because this story will take you into the frozen hell of the Ardennes, where ordinary men became legends. Let me take you back to mid-December 1944. By this point in the war, it seemed like Nazi Germany was finished. The Allies had liberated France. They'd pushed the Germans back across the Rhine. Every day brought news of another German city falling, another Wehrmacht division surrendering. In headquarters across Europe, Allied commanders were already planning victory parades and discussing how to divide up Germany after the inevitable surrender. Along an 85-mile stretch of the Ardennes Forest, roughly 80,000 American troops were stationed in what everyone called the Ghost Front. It was the quietest sector of the entire Western Front, a place where green troops were sent to get their first taste of combat without much danger, and where exhausted veterans were rotated to rest and recover. The forest was beautiful in a haunting way, dense with pine trees and rolling hills, now covered in a thick blanket of snow that muffled every sound. Private James Larkin, just 19 years old from a small town in Ohio, wrote a letter home on December 15th. He told his mother not to worry, that he was safe, that the war would probably be over by spring, and that he'd be home for her birthday in May. He sealed that letter and handed it to the mail clerk, never knowing he'd be dead within 48 hours. Sergeant Paul Miller, a veteran of the Normandy invasion, sat in his foxhole that night playing cards with his squad. They joked about the cold, about the terrible coffee, about the packages from home that never seemed to arrive. One soldier, Private Tommy Chun, kept insisting he heard something in the distance, a low rumbling that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The others laughed at him, told him he was hearing things, that it was probably just thunder from a distant storm. But Tommy Chun wasn't hearing things. In the darkness beyond their positions, something monstrous was stirring. Hidden in the German forests across the border, over 100,000 German troops were moving into position. 1,200 tanks and assault guns rolled forward under radio silence. 1,900 artillery pieces were being aimed at American positions. Hitler himself had planned this operation, codenamed Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. It was his last roll of the dice, his final attempt to split the Allied armies, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force the British and Americans to negotiate a separate peace. The man chosen to lead this offensive was Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, though the actual tactical command fell to several younger generals who believed in Hitler's vision. They'd assembled a force unlike anything the Germans had fielded since the early days of the war. Elite SS Panzer divisions, experienced Wehrmacht infantry, and every tank, every gun, every drop of fuel that Germany could scrape together. The plan was audacious to the point of madness. German forces would punch through the weak American lines in the Ardennes, then race westward toward Antwerp, splitting the British forces to the north from the American forces to the south. Bad weather was forecast, which meant Allied air power would be grounded. The Germans would have a brief window, perhaps a week, to accomplish what seemed impossible. But here's what made this plan truly terrifying. The Germans weren't just counting on surprise and overwhelming force. They'd organized special units, commandos who spoke perfect English and wore American uniforms. Their job was to infiltrate behind American lines, change road signs, cut communication wires, and spread chaos and confusion. They would make American troops doubt their own eyes, suspect their own comrades, turn order into pandemonium. Lieutenant Colonel Otto Skorzeny, Hitler's favorite commando, personally trained these men. He told them they were going to change the course of the war. He told them that in a week, they'd be drinking champagne in Antwerp, while the British ran for their boats and the Americans retreated in disorder. He told them they were going to make history. At midnight on December 16th, those German commandos crept across the front lines and began their deadly work. But the main assault was still hours away. The American troops along the Ghost Front slept fitfully in their foxholes, cold and uncomfortable but not afraid. After all, everyone knew the Germans were beaten. Everyone knew the war was almost over. Everyone knew they were safe here in this quiet sector. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. 5:30 a.m., December 16th, 1944. Total darkness still covered the Ardennes Forest. Then, without any warning whatsoever, the world exploded. 1,900 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along the entire 85-mile front. It was the largest artillery barrage on the Western Front since D-Day. Shells screamed out of the darkness and slammed into American positions with devastating effect. The frozen ground magnified every explosion, turning single shells into compound blasts that threw deadly splinters of ice and frozen earth in every direction. Private Larkin, the 19-year-old from Ohio who'd written that final letter to his mother, woke up to find his foxhole collapsing around him. Earth and snow and shrapnel filled the air. The soldier next to him, his best friend since basic training, simply disappeared in a direct hit. One moment he was there, the next moment there was nothing but a smoking crater. The barrage lasted 90 minutes. 90 minutes of unrelenting hell, of earth-shaking explosions, of screaming men and falling trees and collapsing bunkers. Communication lines were cut. Radios were destroyed. Officers tried to shout orders but couldn't hear their own voices over the thunder of the guns. When the barrage finally lifted, many American soldiers felt a moment of relief. They thought the worst was over. They thought they'd survived. Then they heard the tanks. Out of the early morning gloom came the German armor. Tiger tanks, Panther tanks, King Tigers weighing 70 tons each. Their massive guns capable of destroying any American tank from over a mile away. Behind the armor came waves of infantry, experienced troops who'd learned their craft on the brutal Eastern Front, men who knew how to fight in winter, men who showed no mercy. The American lines simply disintegrated in some places. Entire companies were overrun before they could even report they were under attack. In the town of Lanzerath, a single intelligence and reconnaissance platoon of just 18 men found themselves facing an entire German battalion. They fought from a house on the edge of town, and for nearly 20 hours, those 18 Americans held off over 500 Germans, inflicting heavy casualties and delaying the German timetable by almost a full day. When they finally ran out of ammunition and surrendered, the German commander was so impressed he allowed them to keep their weapons and walked them through his lines personally, saluting them as fellow soldiers. But most units weren't so fortunate. The 106th Infantry Division, which had only arrived in the Ardennes a few days earlier for what was supposed to be a quiet introduction to combat, found itself surrounded. Over 7,000 men from two entire regiments were cut off on a ridge called the Schnee Eifel. They fought desperately, but they had no chance. Within 3 days, they would be forced to surrender in the largest mass surrender of American forces in the European theater. News of the attack spread slowly through the Allied command. At first, nobody believed the reports. The numbers were too large, the scope too vast. Surely this was just a local counterattack, a spoiling raid, nothing more. But as the morning progressed and more reports came in, the terrible truth became clear. This was a full-scale offensive. The Germans were attacking in overwhelming strength. The American front was breaking. In Luxembourg, General Omar Bradley was hosting a party when he got the news. In England, Supreme Commander Eisenhower was in a meeting. In Paris, officers were preparing for Christmas celebrations. The entire Allied command structure had been caught completely off guard. The Ghost Front wasn't so quiet anymore. By nightfall on December 16th, the situation was catastrophic. German forces had penetrated up to 5 miles into American lines in some places. Entire battalions had been wiped out. Thousands of prisoners had been taken. Critical road junctions were falling, and the weather forecast showed more snow, more fog, more clouds that would keep Allied planes grounded. But here's where the story takes its first turn toward hope. Because while the High Command was still trying to figure out what was happening, the individual American units on the ground were already starting to fight back. Not in any organized way, not according to any grand strategy, but simply because they were soldiers, and they refused to quit. In the town of St. Vith, Brigadier General Bruce Clark organized a desperate defense. He pulled together remnants of shattered units, stragglers who'd escaped the initial onslaught, even cooks and clerks and typists, and he told them they were going to hold this town because if they didn't, the Germans would have a clear road to the Meuse River. St. Vith had to hold, and it did. For 6 crucial days, against overwhelming odds, American forces defended St. Vith. They fought from house to house, street to street. They knocked out German tanks with bazookas at point-blank range. They held their ground even as their positions were pounded by artillery, even as German infantry swept around their flanks, even as the situation became more hopeless with each passing hour. 80 miles to the south, in the town of Bastogne, an even more important drama was beginning to unfold. Bastogne sat at the center of a critical road network. 7 major roads converged there. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the entire southern shoulder of the German advance. If the Germans took it, they could maintain their momentum westward. If the Americans held it, the entire German offensive would be slowed, perhaps even stopped. The 101st Airborne Division, veterans of the D-Day jump into Normandy, were rushed to Bastogne in a convoy of trucks. They arrived just hours before the Germans surrounded the town. Their commander, General Anthony McAuliffe, quickly realized they were going to be cut off, but he also realized they had no choice but to stay. Bastogne had to be held at all costs. By December 19th, the situation was clear. The Germans had punched a bulge into the American lines, a salient 60 miles deep and 40 miles wide. That's why history would call this the Battle of the Bulge. The shape on the maps looked like a bulge pushing westward into Allied territory, but the Germans were already behind schedule. St. Vith was still holding. Bastogne was surrounded, but refusing to surrender. All along the northern shoulder of the Bulge, the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions were fighting a brilliant delaying action, falling back slowly, making the Germans pay in blood for every mile. Most critically, the weather was beginning to clear. The storm was far from over, but the first cracks in the German plan were starting to show. December 22nd, 1944, the men of the 101st Airborne in Bastogne woke to find themselves completely surrounded. German forces had closed the ring. No supplies could get in. No wounded could get out. The defenders were on their own. That morning, German officers approached the American lines under a white flag. They carried a message for the American commander, an ultimatum. It was typed on official Wehrmacht stationery, and it laid out the situation with brutal clarity. The Americans in Bastogne were surrounded by superior German forces. Resistance was useless. The honorable course was to surrender to avoid needless bloodshed. If the Americans refused, the Germans would unleash their full firepower and annihilate the garrison. The German officers were blindfolded and brought to General McAuliffe's headquarters. An aide translated the message and handed it to McAuliffe. The general read it, thought for a moment, and then said one word that would become legend: nuts. His staff looked at each other, confused. One officer asked what he meant. McAuliffe shrugged. I meant what I said. Nuts, that's my answer. His staff tried to explain that the Germans probably wouldn't understand American slang. Maybe they should write something more formal. McAuliffe shook his head. That's my message. Tell them to go to hell. The aide sat down and typed out the official American response. To the German commander, nuts. The American commander. When this message was delivered to the German officers, they were baffled. The American officer escorting them back explained in his best German that it meant the same as go to hell, and that the Americans would not surrender. One of the German officers nodded slowly, understanding dawning on his face. "Is that so?" he said. "We will kill many Americans. This is too bad." The American officer looked at him and said, "We'll kill many Germans too. Merry Christmas." That response, that single word nuts, became a rallying cry not just for the defenders of Bastogne but for American forces all across the Ardennes. It captured something essential about the American spirit in that dark moment. They were surrounded, outnumbered, low on ammunition, freezing in their foxholes, but they absolutely refused to quit. But make no mistake, the situation was desperate. The men in Bastogne were running out of everything. Medical supplies were almost gone. Surgeons were operating without anesthesia. Wounded men lay in the snow because there was no room in the aid stations. Food was down to 1 meal per day, often just a can of cold beans. Ammunition was being rationed carefully. Every bullet had to count, and it was cold. Not just uncomfortable cold, but the kind of bone-deep, life-threatening cold that turned feet black with frostbite, that froze morphine in syringes, that killed men who'd survived German bullets. Soldiers who'd fought across Europe said they'd never experienced anything like it. Many would later say that the cold was worse than the Germans. The weather wasn't just affecting the Americans. On December 22nd, something happened that would change everything. The skies began to clear, the fog lifted, the clouds parted, and for the first time since the battle began, Allied aircraft could fly. What followed was one of the most impressive displays of air power in military history. Over 5,000 Allied aircraft took to the skies. Heavy bombers hit German supply lines. Fighter bombers strafed German columns on every road. Transport planes began dropping supplies to the surrounded garrison at Bastogne. The men on the ground looked up and saw hundreds of parachutes blossoming in the sky, carrying ammunition, medical supplies, food. They cheered until they were hoarse, but the air support, while crucial, couldn't win the battle alone. That would require a miracle on the ground, and the man expected to deliver that miracle was General George S. Patton. Patton was commanding the Third Army to the south of the Bulge. When the attack began, he'd been planning his own offensive eastward. Now Eisenhower needed him to do something that seemed impossible. Disengage from his current positions, turn his entire army 90 degrees north, and attack into the southern flank of the German Bulge. And he needed it done fast. At a meeting on December 19th, Eisenhower asked Patton how quickly he could attack. Patton's answer stunned everyone in the room. December 22nd, 3 divisions. The other officers thought he was joking, turning an entire army 90 degrees and moving it over 100 miles in winter conditions, across icy roads, through territory filled with German infiltrators and commandos, and doing it in just 3 days? It was impossible, but Patton had already anticipated Eisenhower's order. He'd already started moving his forces. He'd already drawn up 3 different contingency plans. And on December 22nd, exactly as promised, 3 divisions of Patton's Third Army smashed into the southern shoulder of the German Bulge and began fighting their way toward Bastogne. The Germans suddenly found themselves in a nightmare. They were still pushing westward, still trying to reach the Meuse River, still believing they could win. But now they had American forces attacking them from the south. The northern shoulder of their advance had never broken. St. Vith, after 6 days of heroic defense, had finally fallen. But it had delayed the Germans so long that their timetable was in ruins. And Bastogne, that critical road junction, was still holding. On December 23rd, the weather was clear and cold. Allied aircraft were flying constant missions. In one 24-hour period, Allied pilots flew over 1,500 sorties, destroying hundreds of German vehicles, killing thousands of German soldiers, cutting supply lines, disrupting communications. The Luftwaffe tried to contest the skies, but they were hopelessly outnumbered and outflown. In Bastogne, the defenders were still holding, but barely. They'd repulsed multiple German attacks, but each attack cost them men they couldn't replace. The perimeter was shrinking, German artillery was pounding them constantly. SS troops were probing for weak points. Everyone knew that relief had to come soon or it would come too late. Sergeant Barney Alford from Alabama was manning a machine gun position on the edge of town when the Germans launched a massive attack on Christmas Eve. Waves of infantry supported by tanks came straight at his position. He fired until his barrel was glowing red. When his ammunition ran out, he used his rifle. When that ran out, he used grenades. When those ran out, he fought with his bare hands. When the attack was finally repulsed, there were over 70 dead Germans in front of his position. He'd held his ground alone for over 2 hours. Later, he would receive the Medal of Honor. But that night, covered in blood and shaking from exhaustion, he just slumped against a wall and cried. Christmas Day, 1944, was unlike any Christmas these men had ever experienced. There were no presents, no decorations, no trees, just cold and fear and death. But something remarkable happened that day. Chaplains held services in frozen foxholes. Men shared their last cigarettes and their last cans of food. They sang Christmas carols in voices hoarse from shouting orders and screaming in battle. For a few brief moments, in the middle of the worst battle of their lives, they remembered what they were fighting for. That same day, Patton's forces were getting closer to Bastogne. They were fighting literally for every yard. The Germans knew what was happening, and they threw everything they had at Patton's divisions. The fighting was savage, close range, often hand-to-hand. Tanks dueled at ranges so close that crews could see each other's faces. Infantry charged across open snow fields into machine gun fire. The casualties were horrific on both sides. On December 26th, at 4:45 in the afternoon, the lead elements of the 4th Armored Division smashed through the German lines and made contact with the defenders of Bastogne. The siege was broken. The road was open. Bastogne had been relieved. When word spread through the town that help had arrived, hardened paratroopers openly wept. Men who hadn't slept in days suddenly collapsed from exhaustion. But there was no time to celebrate. The Germans were still attacking. The battle was far from over. By this point, the German offensive had completely stalled. They'd never reached the Meuse River. They'd never captured Bastogne. They'd never split the Allied armies. And now, with Patton attacking from the south, with the northern shoulder holding firm, with clear skies allowing constant air attacks, the Germans were being ground to pieces. Hitler refused to accept defeat. He ordered his commanders to keep attacking, to take Bastogne, to push forward at any cost. But his generals knew the truth. The offensive had failed. Now it was just a question of how many more men would die before Hitler accepted reality. The final week of December and the first weeks of January saw some of the most intense fighting of the entire battle. The Germans, realizing their offensive had failed, now fought desperately to hold the ground they'd gained. The Americans and British, smelling victory, pushed from both north and south to pinch off the Bulge and trap the German forces inside. What made this phase of the battle particularly brutal was that the Germans were no longer advancing toward objectives. They were simply trying to survive, to escape. And men fighting for survival are the most dangerous kind of enemy. They defended every village, every hill, every crossroad with fanatical determination. The 2nd Armored Division, fighting in the northern sector, engaged German panzer forces in some of the largest tank battles of the Western Front. At the town of Celles, American tank crews and infantry surrounded an entire German armored spearhead that had penetrated to within 4 miles of the Meuse River, the deepest German penetration of the entire battle. In the fighting that followed, the Americans destroyed 82 German tanks and captured another 800 prisoners. It was the death blow to German hopes of reaching the Meuse. Private First Class Melvin Biddle, a 21-year-old from Indiana, was fighting with his unit near the Belgian town of Houffalize when his company came under intense fire from German positions. Without orders, without backup, Biddle single-handedly assaulted the enemy positions. He crawled through snow, through enemy fire, close enough to throw grenades into German foxholes. He killed multiple enemy soldiers and forced the rest to retreat. Later that same day, when German counterattackers tried to retake the position, Biddle again charged forward alone, this time with a machine gun he'd captured. He held off an entire German company by himself. His actions that day would earn him the Medal of Honor, but more importantly, they saved his entire company from being overrun. All across the battlefield, similar acts of incredible courage were happening. Men who'd grown up as ordinary Americans, farmers and mechanics and shop clerks, were performing extraordinary feats. They weren't professional soldiers. Many had been in the army for less than a year, but they fought with a determination and skill that amazed even the veteran German troops they faced. The soldiers also had to contend with an enemy they couldn't shoot: the weather. January brought even worse conditions than December. Temperatures dropped to -15 degrees Fahrenheit. Men lost fingers and toes to frostbite. Entire units had to be rotated out of the line because so many men were incapacitated by the cold. Tanks wouldn't start, engines froze solid, oil turned to sludge, weapons malfunctioned. Simply staying alive became a battle in itself. Medics performed miracles under these conditions. They treated wounds in the open, in the snow, often under fire. They worked without anesthesia because morphine froze in the syringes. They performed amputations with tools that were little better than what a Civil War surgeon might have used, and they did it all while being targeted by German snipers who showed no respect for the Red Cross markings. Technical Sergeant Isidore Jackman was with his unit near Flamièrge, Belgium, when a German tank attack overwhelmed American positions. 2 American tank destroyers were hit and disabled. The crews bailed out but were pinned down by German fire. Jackman, armed only with rifle grenades, ran forward through a hail of machine gun bullets. He positioned himself between the German tanks and the American crewmen and began firing at the tanks from a range of less than 30 yards. He knocked out one tank, damaged another, and allowed the American crews to escape, but in doing so, he was killed by German fire. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, one of 17 Medals of Honor awarded for actions during the Battle of the Bulge. By mid-January, the Allied counteroffensive was in full swing. British forces under Montgomery attacked from the north. Patton's forces pushed from the south. The German Bulge was being squeezed from both sides. On January 16th, exactly 1 month after the German offensive began, American forces attacking from north and south met at Houffalize, Belgium. The Bulge had been eliminated. The German forces that had penetrated so deeply into Allied territory were either destroyed, captured, or in full retreat. But this victory came at a terrible cost. The small Belgian town of Malmedy had been the site of one of the worst atrocities of the battle. On December 17th, German SS troops had captured over 80 American prisoners near Malmedy. The Americans were disarmed and gathered in a field. Then, without warning, the Germans opened fire with machine guns. Those who survived the initial volley and tried to run were hunted down and shot. 84 Americans were murdered that day in what became known as the Malmedy Massacre, when American forces recaptured the area and found the frozen bodies still lying where they'd fallen in the snow. The news spread like wildfire through American units. It hardened their resolve and, in some cases, led to revenge killings of German prisoners. War, which is always terrible, became even more savage. The last German troops withdrew from the Bulge on January 28th. The battle was over. Now came the grim task of counting the cost. The numbers are staggering and almost impossible to comprehend. In 6 weeks of fighting, American forces suffered over 89,000 casualties, 19,000 Americans killed, 47,000 wounded, 23,000 missing or captured. It was the bloodiest battle in American history up to that point, surpassing even horrific Civil War battles like Gettysburg and Antietam. The Germans suffered even worse. They lost over 100,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. More critically, they lost nearly 800 tanks and assault guns, weapons they could never replace. They expended fuel reserves that could never be replenished. They threw away their last strategic reserve, their last chance to change the outcome of the war. From a purely military standpoint, the Battle of the Bulge was Hitler's last gamble, and it failed catastrophically. The offensive delayed the Allied advance by perhaps 6 weeks, but in exchange, Germany permanently lost its ability to defend itself. When the Allies resumed their advance in February, German resistance crumbled. Units that might have fought effectively if properly supplied and supported were now just hollow shells. The road to Berlin was open. But beyond the military statistics, beyond the strategic implications, the Battle of the Bulge revealed something profound about the American soldier. These weren't professional warriors from a militaristic society. They were citizen soldiers, men who'd been farmers, and students and factory workers. Just a few years earlier, they'd been drafted, trained, and shipped overseas to fight in a war half a world away from home. And when they were hit by overwhelming force, when they were surrounded, outnumbered, and freezing to death, they didn't break. They held, they fought back, they won. Consider the defenders of St. Vith, who held out for 6 days against vastly superior forces, buying precious time for the Allied response. Consider the men of Bastogne, who refused to surrender even when completely surrounded. Consider Patton's Third Army, which accomplished the impossible by turning 90 degrees and attacking in just 3 days. Consider the air crews who flew mission after mission in terrible weather, knowing that one mistake meant death. Consider the medics who treated wounds while under fire, the engineers who kept roads open through blizzards, the supply troops who kept ammunition and food moving forward even when German commandos were operating behind the lines. The psychological impact of the battle was immense. For the Americans, it was a wake-up call. They'd been perhaps too confident after the liberation of France, too certain that the war was all but over. The German offensive shattered that complacency, but it also proved that American troops could stand up to the best the German army could throw at them, and not just survive, but win. For the Germans, the battle was the end of hope. When the offensive failed, when the last reserves were expended, when the last tanks were destroyed, there was no longer any question about how the war would end. It was just a matter of time. Some historians argue that the Battle of the Bulge actually shortened the war by destroying German forces that might otherwise have prolonged the defense of Germany itself. The stories of individual heroism are almost endless. Staff Sergeant Archer Gammon led a platoon that was attacked by enemy tanks and infantry near Bastogne. When his position was about to be overrun, Gammon charged forward alone with a bazooka and destroyed one tank. Then he grabbed a machine gun from a wounded soldier and held off the German infantry. When his ammunition ran out, he stood and fought with a rifle until he was killed. His actions allowed his platoon to withdraw. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding a tank battalion in Patton's army, led the spearhead that broke through to Bastogne. His aggressive leadership and tactical skill were instrumental in relieving the siege. Years later, he would become Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, and the Army's main battle tank, the M1 Abrams, would be named in his honor. Captain Wallace Crittenden from the 101st Airborne was serving as a forward observer in Bastogne when his observation post was overrun by German troops. Rather than allow classified information to fall into enemy hands, Crittenden destroyed his radio equipment and codes even while under fire, then fought his way back to American lines. His dedication to security, even in the face of death, exemplified the professionalism of American forces. The Belgian and French civilians caught in the battle zone suffered terribly as well. Entire villages were destroyed. Thousands of civilians died in the crossfire or from exposure. Many had their homes occupied by German troops, then retaken by Americans, then fought over again. The town of Houffalize was bombed by Allied aircraft, then shelled by both sides, until literally not a single building was left standing. The local population had to be evacuated, and many never returned. One of the most remarkable stories involves a young Belgian nurse named Augusta Chiwi. She was one of only 2 nurses in Bastogne when the siege began. For 10 days, she worked without rest in an aid station that was treating over 100 wounded men. She worked through artillery bombardments, through periods when the aid station itself was hit by shells, through times when they had almost no medical supplies left. She saved countless lives through her skill and dedication. After the war, she returned to nursing and lived until 2015, just a few months shy of her 95th birthday. In her later years, she received numerous honors for her service, including Belgium's highest civilian decoration. Today, 80 years after that cold December morning when German artillery shattered the peace of the Ardennes Forest, We remember the Battle of the Bulge for what it truly was, a defining moment in American military history and a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The battlefields are peaceful now. The Ardennes Forest has regrown. Belgian villages have been rebuilt. The foxholes have filled in and the tank tracks have faded. But the memory remains. In cemeteries across Belgium and Luxembourg, thousands of white crosses and stars of David mark the graves of Americans who never came home. The Henry Chappelle American Cemetery, the Ardennes American Cemetery, and the Luxembourg American Cemetery hold the remains of over 12,000 American servicemen who died in the battle. Each grave represents not just a soldier, but a family shattered by loss, a future that never was, a life cut short in service to freedom. The Belgian people have never forgotten. In towns across the Ardennes, monuments and museums preserve the memory of the battle. Every year, on the anniversary of the battle, Belgians place American flags on the graves of fallen soldiers. Children are taught about the sacrifice made by young Americans who came from across an ocean to liberate a country most had never heard of before the war. This gratitude, passed down through generations, is one of the most beautiful legacies of the battle. For the veterans who survived, the Battle of the Bulge defined their lives in ways large and small. They returned home to build families, start businesses, become teachers and doctors and civic leaders. Most never talked much about what they'd experienced. When they gathered at reunions in later years, they spoke not about the horror, but about the camaraderie, about the friends they'd made, about the little moments of humor that somehow survived, even in the worst circumstances. Donald Bulge, a veteran of the 101st Airborne who fought in Bastogne, wrote several books about his experiences. He described the bond between the men who fought there as something that could never be explained to someone who wasn't there. "We didn't fight for flags or abstractions," he wrote. "We fought for each other. We fought because the man next to us was depending on us, and we wouldn't let him down." As of today, December 2024, only a handful of Battle of the Bulge veterans are still alive. They're all over 100 years old now. Each year, a few more pass away, taking with them their first-hand memories of those terrible days. Soon, there will be none left. That's why it's crucial that we remember, that we tell their stories, that we ensure future generations understand what these men endured and what they accomplished. The lessons of the Battle of the Bulge remain relevant today. It showed that surprise attacks can happen even when they seem impossible. It showed that overconfidence is dangerous. It showed that victory is never certain until it's achieved. But most importantly, it showed that ordinary people, when called upon, are capable of extraordinary courage and sacrifice. Think about what these men faced. They were cold, hungry, exhausted, surrounded, and scared. They had every reason to give up, to surrender, to run. But they didn't. They stood their ground. They fought back. They refused to quit. That determination, that refusal to surrender in the face of overwhelming odds, that willingness to sacrifice everything for a cause greater than themselves, that is the true legacy of the Battle of the Bulge. The battle also demonstrated the importance of leadership at every level. From Eisenhower's calm response to the crisis, to Patton's aggressive counterattack, to McAuliffe's defiant nuts, to the countless squad leaders and sergeants who held their units together in desperate circumstances, leadership made the difference between victory and defeat. In our modern world, where wars are often fought with drones and precision weapons, it's easy to forget what these men endured. They fought in brutal, primitive conditions. They lived in holes in the ground. They went days without hot food or sleep. They watched friends die beside them, and yet they persevered. The Battle of the Bulge also reminds us of the cost of freedom. These men didn't have to be there. America wasn't directly threatened. They could have stayed home, let Europe sort out its own problems. But they understood something fundamental, that evil unopposed will spread, that tyranny unchecked will grow, and that sometimes good men must stand up and fight, even at terrible cost. Today, as we mark the 80th anniversary of this epic battle, we owe it to those silent warriors to remember their sacrifice. We owe it to them to tell their stories, to honor their memory, to ensure that what they fought for, freedom, democracy, human dignity, is never taken for granted. The snow still falls in the Ardennes each winter. just as it did in December 1944. But now it falls on monuments instead of battlefields, on memorials instead of mass graves. The forest is silent again, but if you listen carefully, you can almost hear the echoes of that terrible winter when ordinary men became heroes, when the fate of the world hung in the balance, and when the American spirit proved unbreakable. This has been the story of the Battle of the Bulge. 80 years later, 19,000 Americans gave their lives in that frozen forest. Tens of thousands more were wounded, their bodies and minds scarred forever. But they stopped Hitler's last offensive. They broke the back of Nazi Germany. They proved that freedom is worth fighting for. If this story moved you, if it made you appreciate the sacrifice of these silent warriors, please hit that like button. Leave a comment below telling us what aspect of this battle impacted you most. And subscribe to Silent Warriors, because we're committed to telling these stories, to honoring these heroes, to making sure that their sacrifice is never forgotten. Remember, freedom isn't free. It was bought with the blood of heroes in places like the Ardennes Forest. The least we can do is remember them. Until next time, this is Silent Warriors. Never forget,